The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery, painting the marble headstones in amber light. Lila's hands trembled slightly as she knelt before the grave, carefully removing the withered flowers that had begun to brown at the edges. From her basket, she produced a fresh bouquet of white lilies and purple hyacinths, arranging them with practiced care against the cool stone. "I brought your favorite today, Margaret," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle rustle of leaves. "At least, I think they might have been your favorite." She didn't notice the tall figure watching from beneath a nearby oak tree, his expensive suit out of place among the quiet rows of the dead. His eyes, lined with grief and something like wonder, never left her slender form as she tenderly adjusted the flowers. When Lila finally stood, brushing soil from her knees, she turned to find him just feet away. His sudden presence startled her, and the basket nearly slipped from her grasp. "That was my wife," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The weight of those 4 simple words hung between them like a physical thing. Lila felt her chest tighten, her social anxiety flaring as she struggled to find words. The man's eyes were fixed on her, waiting for an explanation she wasn't sure she could give. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to when Lila first discovered Margaret's grave. Lila Parker had always been the girl who blended into backgrounds. At 28, she owned a small flower shop on the edge of Millfield, where she could hide behind arrangements and speak through petals rather than words. Her hands were always slightly stained with green, her clothes carrying the faint scent of roses and soil. She preferred the company of flowers to people. Flowers didn't judge her stammering or flush of embarrassment when attention turned her way. On that Tuesday in April, she had been delivering a funeral arrangement to the cemetery, a massive wreath of white carnations for the Henderson service. After the delivery, something compelled her to wander through the quiet pathways between the graves. That's when she saw it, a simple headstone with wilting daisies drooping sadly against the marble. Margaret Elizabeth Winters, beloved wife, 1978 to 2022. Something about the neglected flowers bothered Lila deeply. Death was lonely enough without being forgotten. Without thinking, she returned to her van and gathered a small bouquet of fresh tulips she'd been saving for her apartment. Kneeling before the stranger's grave, she replaced the dying flowers with the vibrant ones. "There," she whispered. "That's better, isn't it?" It became a ritual after that. Every week, Lila would bring fresh flowers to Margaret's grave. She began talking to the headstone, softly at first, then with growing confidence. She read poetry, shared stories about difficult customers, confessed fears she couldn't tell her best friend Mia. "I don't know why I keep coming back," she told Margaret's grave one evening, 3 weeks into her visits. "I never knew you, but somehow I feel less alone here. Is that strange?" "Probably. Added to the list of reasons people find me odd." Her curiosity about Margaret grew with each visit. Who was this woman? What had her life been like? The dates on the stone indicated she'd only been 44 when she died, too young. Lila began researching. The local library yielded an obituary that mentioned Margaret's husband, David Winters, a successful real estate developer who had built half the luxury properties in the county. There were mentions of charitable donations, of a foundation in Margaret's name, but little about the woman herself. Sometimes during her visits, Lila noticed expensive fresh flowers appearing between her own offerings, arrangements she recognized as coming from an upscale florist in the city, not her humble shop. Someone else visited Margaret, though their paths never crossed. Until they did. It happened on a rainy Thursday. Lila had brought a book of poetry and a small umbrella. Huddled beside the grave, reading aloud, she didn't hear the approaching footsteps until a shadow fell across the page. A tall man in a charcoal suit stood watching her, confusion evident on his handsome, weathered face. Despite the rain, he held no umbrella, his salt and pepper hair dampening against his forehead. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice carrying the unmistakable edge of wealth and authority. "Why are you at my wife's grave?" Lila's throat closed in panic. She scrambled to her feet, the book falling into a puddle. "I'm so sorry, I was just—" The words tangled on her tongue as her face burned with embarrassment. "You've been bringing flowers," he said, his tone softening slightly as he noticed her distress. "Why?" "They were wilted," Lila managed, staring at her mud-speckled shoes. "The first time I came, I couldn't just leave them like that." David Winters studied her for a long moment, rain dripping from his expensive suit. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Lila trembling beside the grave. She didn't return for 2 weeks after that, too mortified by the encounter. When she confided in Mia over coffee, her friend was fascinated rather than concerned. "You've been visiting a stranger's grave for months?" Mia asked, stirring her latte. "That's either the sweetest or creepiest thing I've ever heard." "I feel connected to her somehow," Lila admitted. "But now her husband thinks I'm some kind of stalker." "Or maybe he's touched that someone cares," Mia suggested. "Not everyone has people who remember them after they're gone." Those words stayed with Lila, and eventually, her need to return outweighed her embarrassment. When she arrived at Margaret's grave the following Sunday, she found something unexpected, a sealed envelope leaning against the headstone, her name written across the front in elegant script. With trembling fingers, she opened it to find a handwritten letter. "I found this among Margaret's things," it read. "I believe she would want you to have it." Inside was another envelope, older and worn at the edges. The letter inside was dated just weeks before Margaret's death. "Sometimes I wonder if anyone truly sees me," Margaret had written. "David works so hard to give me everything, except what I need most, understanding. The depression feels like drowning while everyone watches from the shore, thinking I'm just swimming. I smile and attend charity functions while inside I'm screaming. Perhaps that's why I keep returning to the small flower shop on Maple Street. The shy girl there arranges bouquets with such care, as if each bloom matters deeply. She doesn't know me, but her small kindnesses are like lifelines on my darkest days." Lila's heart pounded. Margaret had been a customer. She remembered her now, the elegant woman who often purchased single stems, who always smiled, but whose eyes held a sadness Lila recognized from her own mirror. The revelation shattered Lila's imagined version of Margaret's perfect life. This woman, with all her wealth and beauty, had been suffering silently. The connection Lila felt wasn't imagined. It had been real, if unspoken. Gathering her courage, Lila decided to find David Winters. She needed to understand more about the woman whose grave had become her sanctuary. It took 3 attempts before she managed to speak to him. The first time, she lost her nerve outside his office building. The second, his secretary politely but firmly turned her away. The third time, she waited by Margaret's grave until he appeared. "Mr. Winters," she called softly as he approached. "I need to talk to you about Margaret." His face hardened. "There's nothing to discuss. Please stop coming here." "She knew me," Lila said quickly, her voice stronger than she expected. "I found out she used to visit my flower shop. She left a letter." "What letter?" he demanded, stepping closer. "What are you talking about?" Lila handed him Margaret's writing with shaking hands. As he read, his expression transformed from anger to shock to profound grief. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "I never knew," he whispered. "I thought I gave her everything she could want." "Sometimes what people need isn't things," Lila said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Sometimes it's just being seen." David sank onto a nearby bench, the letter clutched in his hand. "She never told me how bad it was. I was always so busy building our future that I missed her present." Something in his vulnerability gave Lila courage. She sat beside him, leaving careful space between them. "Would you tell me about her? The real Margaret?" That afternoon began a strange friendship. At first, their conversations happened only at the cemetery, brief exchanges about Margaret's favorite books, her passion for painting, her struggle with depression that David had tried to fix with vacations and jewelry rather than understanding. Gradually, their talks extended beyond the graveyard. Coffee at the small cafe near Lila's shop. Lunch in the park where Margaret used to sketch. David helped Lila understand the woman whose grave she'd tended, while Lila helped David see the wife he'd loved but never fully known. "She would have liked you," he told Lila one day as they walked through the botanical gardens Margaret had helped fund. "You both see beauty in small things." "I wish I'd known her better," Lila admitted. "Beyond just the customer who bought single stems." "You knew her better than you think," David replied. "You saw her sadness when I was blind to it. You connected with her spirit even after she was gone." Months passed. Lila found her shyness gradually melting away as she learned to voice her thoughts. David began volunteering at a mental health foundation, sharing Margaret's story to help others. Together, they established a memorial garden at the local hospital where Margaret had received treatment. Which brings us back to that autumn afternoon in the cemetery, with Lila arranging fresh flowers on Margaret's grave and David watching from a distance. As he approached and said those words, "That was my wife," there was no longer accusation in his voice, but gratitude and shared understanding. "I know," Lila replied, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "And I think she brought us together for a reason." David nodded, placing his hand briefly on the headstone. Margaret always did have a way of seeing connections before anyone else did. They stood in comfortable silence as the setting sun painted the cemetery in gold. Two strangers brought together by grief, transformed by understanding, connected by a woman who had touched both their lives in profoundly different ways. "Ready?" David asked finally, offering his arm with the gentle courtesy that had become familiar between them. Lila nodded, no longer the shy girl afraid of her own shadow. In seeking to know Margaret, she had found herself. In tending a stranger's grave, she had cultivated her own courage. As they walked away, Lila glanced back at the flowers brightening the marble stone. Some connections, she had learned, transcend even death. And sometimes, the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places, even a cemetery where a shy girl once replaced the flowers on a stranger's grave.